Hey, world history students. I hope you're having a nice Monday. And so this is going to be our first week where we have a little bit of a different schedule. We're going to actually try to have different time slots where we can sort of talk face to face. And each one of your teachers is going to use their time slot a little bit differently. So I already sent you one video and a little bit of a document that explained how things were going to work with my class. And it's pretty simple. I'm doing everything pretty much the same way as before. All right, I'm still going to post videos. There'll be a couple assignments a week. The only difference is I'm not going to post a video every day. I'm going to post 2 videos a week, and each one of those videos will have a little bit of an assignment. And the difference now is that we are going to meet twice a week just to review the assignments, make sure you understand what's going on, answer any questions you might have. We're pretty much going to cover the same material, just have a little bit of more opportunity for face-to-face interactions. So I think on Tuesday, which will be tomorrow, fifth period, we'll have our Google Meet at 11:30. I'll send you an email invitation. I think there's a way to do it now via Google Class, but I don't know how to do that just yet. So I'll just keep sending email invitations for now. Then sixth period, we will have ours at 1 o'clock. All right, so we'll use that time to go over the lesson for today and the assignment. I should say the lesson in this video and the assignment in this video. And then on Wednesday, around Wednesday morning, afternoon, I will post the second assignment for the week. And then we will meet on, I think, Thursday and Friday. Fifth period we meet Thursday, sixth period we meet Friday to go over that material. Pretty simple. So today's lesson, I find this really interesting. If you look at the topic of the lesson in our syllabus, it's the dark side of human nature. And these next 2 days lessons are going to be about human nature. And that's one of the big reasons that we have studied the Holocaust, because some really interesting things, studies have come out of psychologists, what we call social psychologists, who wondered how the heck could this Holocaust thing happen? This happened in a democracy. Germany was a democracy that allowed these terrible things to happen. And a lot of times in history, we call Nazis evil, which they were. We call Nazi Germany sort of like um, an evil country that wanted world domination to suppress all sorts of different groups of others. And that's true. I'm not denying that. All right. But it's important to realize that the people who lived in Germany weren't that different than you and me. The people who fell victim to the Nazi ideology, and I'm going to say it fell victim. They were brainwashed and indoctrinated, and some of them willingly fell victim to it. Some of them over time just gradually were worn down by it and just eventually just sort of believed in it. But for whatever reason, that ideology held sway to them. Those people aren't that much different than you and me. And there are some psychologists who in the 60s, particularly in the 60s, who did some, and 70s, who did some different experiments to see just how easy is it to get human beings to do awful things. And the results are kind of interesting. So we're going to look at 2 of those experiments. All right, the first one today is what we call the Milgram experiment. And Stanley Milgram was a social psychologist in the 60s. His parents were actually, I believe, Holocaust survivors, I think. And he was just really interested in how could these German people do terrible things to their neighbors? How could they do these terrible things and allow millions of people to just be, murdered systematically. And he wanted to see, is there something unique about Germans, or any could any person kind of fall sway to this? And one of the things he noticed that after World War II was over, a lot of the Nazis had to stand trial. And when they were standing trial for all the terrible things that they had done, a lot of the soldiers said, I was just following orders. Don't blame me. My commanders were telling me to do these terrible things. I was just following orders. And it turns out that defense didn't hold up very well in some of the different courts. But it did make some psychologists think, how far will people go if just because someone of authority is telling them to do something? And so what we're going to do, we're going to watch. I'm going to explain a little bit about one of these experiments that kind of shows how far will people go when somebody of authority tells them to do something. And I want you to put yourself in the shoes of these people who are being experimented on. It's not like When I say being experimented on, it's not like odd things are happening. This is called the Milgram experiment. And we're going to watch this video. It does a nice job of sort of explaining what the experiment was. And then I'm going to show you I'll show you another video of it here after this.
When I learn of incidents such as the massacre of millions of men, women, and children perpetrated by the Nazis in World War II, how is it possible, I ask myself, that ordinary people, who are courteous and decent in everyday life, can act callously, inhumanely, without any limitations of conscience? Now, there are some studies in my discipline, social psychology, that seem to provide a clue to this question. The problem I wanted to study was a little different. It went a little bit further. It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience? These are exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University. It is May 1962. An experiment is being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University. The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area.
Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake.
40 years later, Milgram's infamous experiment, obedience, is still taught in classrooms around the world.
All right, teacher, would you take the test and be seated in front of the shock generator, please, in the next room?
But the experiment was rigged.
The victim was an accomplice of the experiment. The victim, according to plan, provided many wrong answers. His verbal responses were standardized on tape, and each protest was coordinated to a particular voltage level on the shock generator. Now, as teacher, you were seated in front of this impressive-looking instrument, the shock generator. Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock. Your job, the experimenter explains to you, is a word pair test. If he gets each answer correctly, fine, you move on to the next pair. But if he makes a mistake, you are instructed to give him an electric shock, starting with 15 volts. And you increase the shock one step on each error.
That is incorrect. This one will be 195 volts.
The learner was hidden from the teacher by a partition.
Of course, this was all a simulation. Nothing was really happening. But the learner made very convincing sounds of pain as the shocks increased.
This will be at 3:30.
And Milgram found, surprisingly and rather horrifyingly, that the majority of people would actually go right to the very highest level if there was some pressure from a man in a white coat who said things like,
It's absolutely essential that you continue. Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My eyes bother me.
Go on.
Let me out.
in fact, about 65% of the people who he studied, who were normal volunteers from the ordinary population, actually gave the maximum number of volts.
This man was one of those 65%.
This one will be 195 volts. The correct one.
Let me out of here.
Slow. Dance.
Let me out of here. My eyes bother me. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My eyes bother me. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me out.
Responsible for it. Red. That is incorrect. This will be at 3:30. The correct phrase is rich
Let me out of
boy.
here. Let me out of here. My eyes bother me. Let me out, I tell you. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. You have no right to hold me
The
here.
next phrase is
Let me
fast.
out. Let me out. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Bird,
Let me
car, train, plane.
Eventually, the learner pretended to be unconscious.
Continue, teacher.
That is incorrect. This will be 3:45. The correct answer is fast, bird.
What we learned from that experiment is that people will actually do an awful lot when they're put under pressure from authority figures. And the problem is, of course, that when we obey the unjust authority figure, the person who gives us immoral commands, then, of course, awful things can go wrong.
All right, so there you have the Milgram experiment, and that's actual footage of the Milgram experiment of these volunteers who were thought that they were giving an electric shock to someone but really weren't. And the experiment, we'll go over it here in a second, but if you weren't quite sure what was going on there, we'll go over it. But it shows that these were just I want you to keep in mind that these people who were doing this experiment, who volunteered for this experiment, these are just average Americans. Some of them are actually veterans of World War II, believe it or not, but they're just average Americans like you and me. There's nothing unique or not unique about any single one of them. Just average American citizens who are responding to an advertisement to be a part of a psychology experiment. So again, the goal of this experiment, Milgram is a psychologist who is interested in how far people would go in obeying an instruction if it involved harming another person. And again, it was the Holocaust that inspired him to see, all of these Nazi soldiers who said they were just following orders. Is there something unique about Nazis and Germans that allowed them to follow such terrible orders? Or are all humans, even Americans, are we all subject to doing what authority figures tell us to, even if we might think it's wrong? So again, he's interested in how easily ordinary people could be influenced into committing atrocities, for example, like the Germans did in World War II. So if you didn't quite get it, here's the procedure. There were a bunch of volunteers. Again, these are just average citizens. They were, I think, 40 males, I want to say, who were recruited to do an experiment that they were told was about learning. It wasn't about that at all. That's the thing about psychology experiments. They're never about what they say they're about. And at the beginning of the experiment, they are introduced to another person, and they think that this other person is just another volunteer. In reality, this other person is an actor. He's a part of the whole thing. And they're going to draw straws to determine who's going to be the learner, in other words, the person receiving the shocks, and who's going to be the teacher, the person giving the shocks. And it was always fixed. The actor, the person who was in on it the whole time, he was always going to be the learner. And then the actual person that they were studying, the actual volunteer, was always going to be the teacher. The teacher's the person who is supposed to be giving a shock every time the learner answers a question wrong. Likewise, there is also a person in a lab coat who is a part of the whole thing. He's just an actor wearing a lab coat. He is kind of like the person who they think is running the experiment. And so he is going to be the person in the lab coat telling the teacher to keep pushing that electric shock when the learner gets a question wrong. So the learner, and in the case of the video, his name is Mr. Wallace. The learner is supposedly in another room, and supposedly he is strapped to a chair that has electrodes. And the teacher is told to give this learner a shock every time the learner makes a mistake. And every time the learner makes an additional mistake, the teacher's supposed to increase the shock level. And there's this big intricate shock board that goes all the way up to like 450 volts, which is like danger, XXX, severe shock. And it's meant to show that these shocks are going to be bringing a lot of pain and damage to the learner. Now, in reality, the learner was not strapped to any chair. The learner was not getting any shocks, but the experimenter did not know that. He thought that he was just giving shocks to this guy. And as the shocks got higher and higher, the learner, and I think it's pre-recorded, but the learner is making like screaming in pain, like, get me out of here. I have a heart problem. This is hurting me. I'm in pain. Get me out of here. Get me out of here. And essentially the experimenter was supposed to keep the teacher to keep on giving shocks. Now the experimenter wasn't to stop the teacher if the teacher absolutely refused to give a shock. The teacher at any time could have stopped and said, you know what, I'm not doing this experiment anymore, I'm done. I'm going to get up. And some people did that. They said, no, I'm not giving this poor man any more shocks. But the experimenter was supposed to keep, try to influence the teacher. So if the teacher turned to the experimenter and said, man, he seems to be in pain, the experimenter first would say, please continue. Then the experiment requires you to continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice but to continue. And even though physically this experimenter couldn't stop the teacher, um, the experimenter's goal was to try to continue to see how far we could push this average American citizen to keep delivering these, these painful shocks. And here's what we found. 2/3, about 65% of the participants continued to the highest level. They kept giving shocks, all the way up to 450 volts. All the participants went at least to 300 volts with the initial study. Now, Milgram did 18 different variations of this to sort of see just, how much people respond to authority. And it was interesting. He did some experiments where instead of where the experimenter wasn't wearing a lab coat, and what ended up happening is that that decreased the amount of shocks that teachers would give. So if somebody is in uniform, just wearing a lab coat, not even an actual military uniform, just a lab coat, people are more likely to do bad things. Another thing that Milgram would do is, I'm trying to think of some of the other, he did a lot of variations on this. Oh, he would have the experimenter in a completely different room. So in this experiment, the original experiment, the experimenter is sort of at a desk in the room. All right, he tried it in a different way where the experimenter was giving like messages from a different room, so he wasn't physically there. That also decreased the amount of shocks that were given. And the other thing that they did is they actually had, instead of just having the teacher giving the shock, the teacher would actually tell a worker to give the shocks. So the person wasn't actually physically pushing the different levers. They were telling somebody else to push the levers. And what they found out is that compliance went up super high, that if you were telling somebody else to do bad things, you were okay telling people to do the bad things. And it really just played into what the impact that authority has, that we will go a long way. So I want you to think about this. You often hear that, the Nazis are terrible people, they were bad people, and they did terrible things. But what would you do in this light? If you were in Milgram's experiment, would you have continued to give those shocks? Would you have had the wherewithal? Would you have been one of the 1/3 of participants who would have said, no, I'm stopping? Or would you have kept going because, that super smart guy in the lab coat was telling you to do it? Think about that. What do you think? If you were in the military, or in general, if you were just a citizen and you were given directions, you were given order by somebody who wasn't just wearing a lab coat, but wearing a military uniform, or somebody who was an authority figure, whether it's at school or at work, and telling you to do something that you thought was maybe questionable or wrong, would you be able to stand up to that authority figure? I mean, we like to think in America we would, but 2/3 of Americans wouldn't even stand up to a guy in a lab coat. Would you really stand up to a police officer? Would you stand up to your boss? Would you stand up to a principal or even a teacher if they were telling you to do? Hopefully we would, but would you? And if you were a citizen of a country whose government and military was performing immoral and unethical actions to groups of people different from you, like say Jewish people, for example, would you have the ability to stand up and risk not only your well-being, but your family's well-being, to stand up to authority and to speak out for a group that is different from yours, an out-group? Would you, in other words, in Nazi Germany, if you were the average Nazi citizen, before we judge the Germans, and you're okay to judge Nazis, I'm cool with that, terrible people, did terrible things in World War II, awful, disgusting. But the actual average citizen of Germany, would you have been able to stand up? Or as Milgram's experiment shows, would you have just sort of kept going along with it? Especially if you were brainwashed to believe that these Jewish people weren't even citizens, they weren't even worth standing up for. What would you have done? I don't know. When I was your age, I would have said, oh, I believed when I was your age, I would have stood, I would not have given 450 shocks. I would not have done that. I can stand up to authority. Nobody can tell me to do something I don't agree with. Oh, if I would have been alive in Germany, I would have fought hard, and maybe I would have, ended up losing my life for it, but I would have fought to stop all these terrible things from happening. I used to I was always sort of believing that when I was a teenager and I was your age. But now I've seen and I've been in circumstances where it is really, really hard to stand up to authority. So it's important, though, that we do. It's important that we understand our human nature and how we can sometimes be manipulated to do things and to do things to others and go down paths morally that we don't think would normally be possible, but we do anyway, just like the Nazis can or did. So anyway, on Thursday, we're going to do one more experiment that also shows a very famous experiment that we as human beings sometimes, um, even though we think we're moral people, we can sometimes be put in situations that have us act what we would consider in bad ways. Um, so yeah, there is a current event also on Thursday that I want to show you that is very relevant. There are a lot of protests happening around the country right now, and I'm not saying that's right or wrong or anything like that. I mean, I do have some thoughts on it, but we're starting to see a lot of swastikas around. And there is one, there's a sign that goes right along one of these protests with what we've been studying in regards to anti-Semitism. And it's just, it's important to realize that when we study the Holocaust and Nazis, um, we study it because it's an important part of history and it shapes the present as it is today. But we also study it because a lot of the beliefs and a lot of the ideologies of the Nazis we still have present in our world today, and it's important to recognize why we need to be diligent and vigilant, or I'm sorry, diligent in stopping those. All right, so that's that. There is a Google form assignment that goes along with this. It's more of an opinion, a couple questions about the Milgram experiment that are right or wrong, and then it's sort of opinion questions after that. So I'm interested to read what some of your thoughts are. I'm going to ask you if you think you would have. I'm going to pretty much ask you these three questions. I'm very interested in seeing what your responses are. All right, I will be talking to you on Tuesday, everyone. Have a nice time until then. Bye.